The morning Oliver Crane woke up to an empty house, he didn't panic. He made coffee. He showered. He checked his phone with the particular calmness of a man who had never once considered that the person he'd spent 6 years controlling might have figured out how to disappear. What he didn't know was that she hadn't just left. She had been leaving for 2 years, one quiet move at a time, and by the time he noticed she was gone, she was already 3 steps ahead of every play he thought he had. Have you ever watched someone powerful realize, too late, that they underestimated someone they should have feared? Stay with this story. Because what came next changed everything. To understand how it ended, you have to go back to where it began. Not the wedding, not the first date, not the night he said all the right things in the right restaurant with the right wine. You have to go back to a Tuesday in February, 18 months into their marriage. When Noelle Van came home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find every light in the apartment blazing, and Oliver standing in the kitchen with that look on his face. She knew the look before she knew what she'd done wrong. It lived in the set of his jaw, the stillness in his hands, the way he didn't come toward her. "Your colleague called," he said, "Dr. Reeves." Noelle set her bag down slowly. "He called about a patient case. We've been coordinating on, at 9 at night. Patients don't follow business hours." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture, weight. Oliver picked up his coffee mug and set it down again, and the small sound of ceramic on marble was somehow louder than anything he'd said. "I don't like it," he said finally. "I've told you how I feel about the way that man looks at you." Noelle was 31 years old. She had a medical degree, a fellowship, and a caseload that included children with conditions that didn't forgive careless doctors. She had a colleague who called after hours because a 6-year-old's test results had come in and they needed to coordinate before morning rounds. She said none of that. Instead, she said, "I'll let him know to call the main line." Oliver's shoulders dropped a fraction. Satisfaction, quiet and settled. Good girl. She smiled. She had learned to smile. In the bedroom closet, tucked behind the winter coat she'd brought from her apartment before the move, was a shoebox that wasn't for shoes. Inside it, a second phone, prepaid, purchased with cash at a drugstore 40 minutes from the hospital. A small voice recorder. A notebook, handwritten, dated from the beginning. The shoebox had been there for 4 months. Noelle had been planning longer than that. Oliver Crane was the kind of man who looked excellent on paper. Real estate development, inherited money laundered into legitimate ventures, charitable donations to things with children's names attached. He had the handshake of someone who'd practiced it, the laugh of someone who knew when to deploy it, and a face that made people trust him before he'd earned it. He had met Noelle at a hospital gala. She'd been a resident, exhausted, attending because her department head had guilted the whole team into going. Oliver had found her at the edge of the room, half a glass of wine in, and said something that made her laugh for the first time in a month. She'd thought it was fate. She understood now it was targeting. The first time he raised his voice at her, they'd been married 7 months. She'd been shocked enough that she'd cried, and he'd been so remorseful afterward, so genuinely devastated by himself, that she'd spent the next hour comforting him. She recognized later that this was the mechanism. The apology wasn't repair, it was insurance. By the time she understood what she was living inside, leaving felt like trying to escape something with no visible walls. He didn't hit her. Not then, not the way people imagine when they hear the word abuse. What he did was quieter and more precise. He called her phone until she answered. He showed up at the hospital. He made comments about her clothes and then denied making them. He cultivated friendships with her friends until they trusted him more than they trusted her account of any given evening. He managed her money. Their money, he'd corrected gently, because he was better with finances and she was so busy with work, wasn't she? He didn't want her stressed about things he could handle. She'd been isolated so gradually she hadn't felt it happening. One skipped dinner with a friend here. One canceled visit with her sister there. Until one day she looked at her phone and realized she hadn't had an unmonitored conversation in 4 months. Her sister, Blythe, was the one who noticed first. Blythe was 3 years older, lived in Portland, and had a way of saying exactly what she thought, with the particular calm of someone who'd been doing it her whole life. She'd called on a Sunday and listened to Noelle speak for 11 minutes and then said quietly, "When did you stop sounding like yourself?" Noelle hadn't answered. She'd changed the subject. Oliver had been in the next room, but Blythe had planted something that didn't die. The shoebox started the following week. Have you ever had a moment when something just clicked? When you stopped waiting for things to get better and started building a way out? Tell me in the comments. Noelle's hospital was in downtown Chicago. Oliver's office was in the Loop. For 2 years, she had arranged her life so that every ordinary movement could double as cover. She told him she was meeting a colleague for lunch. She was meeting her sister's lawyer friend, quietly, at a coffee shop in Wicker Park that neither of them would normally go to. The lawyer's name was Tomas, a domestic violence specialist who'd been referred by Blythe's friend's sister. A chain of women helping women that stretched further back than Noelle ever mapped. Don't move money yet, Tomas had said at that first meeting. Don't change anything he can see. Document everything. How long will this take? He'd looked at her over his coffee. How long do you need it to be airtight? She understood. For 22 months, Noelle Van documented. She was after all a physician. She understood how to record observations without emotional distortion. Date, time, what was said, what was done, how it escalated. She photographed bruises with the second phone. They had started by then, small and deniable at first, then less so. She kept records of the money he'd moved from her personal account into joint accounts she didn't control. She saved screenshots of texts with timestamps. She installed a voice-activated recorder in the living room that looked like a Bluetooth speaker. She went to work every day and saved children's lives, and came home and made his dinner, and smiled across the table and waited. Oliver, for his part, was not a careful man. He was a man who had never been caught. There's a particular arrogance in that. In men who have gotten away with things for long enough that they stop thinking about getting caught at all. He had grown comfortable. He didn't bother anymore with the careful remorse after a bad night. He didn't notice that she'd stopped crying. He was also, and this would matter enormously, a man who had done things at his company that had nothing to do with Noelle. Blythe had known this for a year before Noelle did. She'd been doing her own quiet research, the particular obsession of a woman watching her sister disappear from across a country. What she'd found was that Oliver Crane had been siphoning money from a development project with a silent partner named Desmond Achebe, and Desmond Achebe had no idea. Desmond had invested $4.2 million on a handshake and friendship, and 11 years of trusting the wrong person. Blythe flew to Chicago and told Noelle over dinner in a restaurant 2 neighborhoods away from their apartment. While Oliver was at a charity event, Noelle had said she was too tired to attend. Noelle had listened to all of it and then sat quietly for a long moment. Does Desmond know any of this? She asked. Not yet. He needs to know, Noelle said. But not yet. What is more satisfying to you? The moment someone strikes back or the moment they watch everything fall apart without lifting a finger? Drop your answer below. Oliver noticed something was wrong on a Wednesday. He couldn't have said what, exactly. It was a feeling, the particular unease of a man whose control has always been invisible to him until it begins to slip. Noelle had been quieter than usual. Her movements in the apartment were different. Not nervous, but deliberate. She wasn't avoiding him, she was simply elsewhere, even when she was standing right in front of him. He checked her phone. He always had the password. He'd made that clear early on, framed as openness, as the kind of transparency that healthy couples had. What he found was nothing unusual. Work texts, a thread with Blythe that was boring, a few messages from colleagues. What he didn't find was the second phone. Because it was in a locker at the hospital she'd rented under her maiden name 8 months ago. On a Thursday in October, Noelle worked a full shift, updated her patient notes, said goodbye to 3 nurses and 1 resident who would all remember it later, and walked out of the hospital into the gray Chicago afternoon. She did not go home. She went to a women's shelter on the north side. Not to stay, but because Tomas had arranged a meeting there with 2 federal agents who had been building a separate case against Oliver Crane for 14 months. What Noelle carried with her in a small drive was evidence that made their case complete. She handed it over in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Then she got in a car that Blythe was driving and they left the city. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. She left a note that said only, "You'll understand soon enough." Oliver found it at 6:15 that evening. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, reading 3 words on a piece of paper. Then he poured himself a drink and told himself she'd come back. She always came back. She had never left before. By Friday morning, he'd called her phone 47 times. Every call went straight to voicemail. Her car was in the garage. Her credit cards hadn't been used. It was as if she'd simply stepped sideways out of existence, and the absence had a quality that Oliver Crane could not name, because he had never felt it before. He felt afraid. He called her hospital. They told him, carefully, that Dr. Van had taken personal leave and they were not authorized to share further information. The formality of it, the policy language politeness, made something cold move through him. By Saturday he'd hired someone. The investigator's name was Garrett Finch. No relation to any name in Oliver's recent memory, a quiet man with a cluttered office in River North who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. Oliver laid out the situation. Missing wife, no warning, no known destination. Finch lit a cigarette and looked at him. How long you been married? 6 years. She ever do this before? No. People don't vanish without preparation, Finch said. What you're describing isn't an impulse. That's a plan. Oliver's jaw tightened. Find her. What Finch found instead within 4 days was something he hadn't been paid to find. Financial records that stopped making sense. Evidence of accounts Noel had opened quietly over the past 22 months. Evidence of money that had been legally, carefully moved. Not stolen, she hadn't taken anything of his. She'd taken only what Thomas had determined was legally hers, in tiny increments over nearly 2 years. She's been planning this, Finch said when he called. His voice was flat and uninflected, the way men's voices get when they're delivering news they don't like being associated with. Months, maybe longer. Oliver was quiet. There's something else, Finch said. I've been running some background and there are some flags on your company accounts that I think you should know about. Someone's been looking into your finances. Not her, someone else. Oliver hung up and sat very still in his darkened office, and for the first time understood that he was not hunting a frightened woman. He was the one being hunted. Have you ever realized, too late, that what you thought was a mistake was actually a trap? That feeling when it clicks? Leave it in the comments. The first call came from his business attorney on a Tuesday. Oliver. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone maintaining professional composure around something they find personally repellent. I need you to come in today. What's this about? Your company's accounts have been subpoenaed. The federal indictment was filed that afternoon. It named Oliver Crane in a 14-count complaint. Wire fraud, financial fraud, conspiracy. The case had been built on records supplied by multiple sources, including a financial forensics firm, a former employee who turned cooperating witness 8 months ago, and documentation provided by Noel Van, who had formally separated from Oliver Crane and was represented by an attorney in Portland, Oregon. By Wednesday morning, the Chicago Tribune had the story. By noon, 3 of Oliver's development deals had collapsed. Partners who had smiled at his charity events were not returning calls. The photograph they ran was from his firm's website. The one where he looked polished and confident, and like exactly the kind of man you'd trust with your money. Desmond Achebe gave a statement to the Tribune. He had, it turned out, been contacted 6 weeks ago by a woman named Blythe, who had provided him with documentation he'd hired his own lawyers to verify before going to the authorities. He'd been cooperative with the federal investigation ever since. His statement was 3 sentences long and contained no anger, just a quiet precision that was somehow more devastating than fury. I trusted Oliver Crane with my family's money, Desmond said. The documentation speaks for itself. Oliver watched all of this from his phone in the lobby of his attorney's office, waiting for a meeting that kept being pushed back. The marble floors gleaming under lights that felt too bright, his reflection fractured in the polished surfaces. He tried to call Noel. He didn't know she was in Portland, sitting at Blythe's kitchen table, watching the same news alerts come through on a phone that wasn't the one he had the number for. He tried to call her sister. Blythe's voicemail picked up on the first ring. This is finished, he said to the empty lobby. He didn't know who he was saying it to. He was arrested on a Thursday morning. 6 federal agents, a warrant, and the particular theater of handcuffs on a man who had spent his entire adult life believing himself untouchable. His neighbors were home. Someone took a photograph from their doorway that later circulated widely enough that it became the header image on 3 different news articles. The search of his home took 11 hours. They took computers, phones, external drives, boxes of documents, the smart speaker in the living room, which, they noted for the record, appeared to have recording capabilities beyond its listed specs. They found, in his home office, a folder of photographs he'd taken of Noel over the years. The particular way he'd arranged them, by incident, by date, told the investigators something about him that no amount of corporate fraud charges could fully capture. His own attorney looked at the folder and then looked at the floor. This doesn't help us, she said. Oliver said nothing. His bail was set at $1.2 million. The judge cited flight risk. His assets, it turned out, were somewhat less liquid than he'd led people to believe, and by the time the financial picture clarified, he was remanded to custody pending trial. Have you ever watched someone finally face what they've been running from? How did it feel? Tell me. Noel heard about the bail decision from Tomas, who called her in Portland on a Friday evening. She was sitting on Blythe's back porch with a cup of tea, watching the lights come on across the neighborhood. Her hands were steady. She'd noticed, in the weeks since leaving Chicago, that her hands had stopped shaking in the mornings. She hadn't realized they'd been shaking until they stopped. It's moving quickly, Tomas said. Good, she said. She'd also, 2 days after leaving Chicago, filed for divorce. The paperwork had been ready for 4 months, prepared by a family law attorney in Portland, who was Thomas's colleague, and had never met Oliver Crane, and therefore couldn't be pressured, confused, or charmed by him. Noelle had signed it in Portland on a Tuesday afternoon and then gone to dinner with Blythe and cried for the first time in a long time. Not from grief exactly, but from the particular release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. She had also, on the advice of Tomas and the federal prosecutors, given a victim impact statement. She'd prepared it the way she prepared case presentations. Organized, specific, without sentiment. The dates, the incidents, the pattern. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The document was 43 pages long. One of the federal prosecutors had called it the most thorough victim documentation she'd ever received. She was a physician. Noelle had heard later that the prosecutor told a colleague. She documented like she was preparing a case. Because she was. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Oliver's defense team made several arguments that would have been more effective if the prosecution hadn't had 22 months of meticulously organized evidence, 2 cooperating witnesses, Desmond Achabe's full cooperation, and Noelle's 43-page statement. They argued financial complexity. They argued misunderstanding. They suggested, with the particular delicacy of men arguing for a man they didn't personally like, that the marriage had been difficult and things had been mischaracterized. The jury took 4 hours. Oliver Crane was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. He was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison. Noelle was in Portland when the verdict came through. She was at the hospital. She'd taken a position at OHSU 3 months after arriving, because she was a physician and her patients didn't stop needing her, because her life had imploded. She heard from Tomas in a break between patients. She stood in the hallway for a long moment. A nurse passing asked if she was all right. "Yes," she said, and then because it was true, "Yes, I actually am." What does justice really feel like? Is it loud, like a victory, or quiet, like finally being able to breathe? Tell me in the comments. She had not anticipated what came after. Not the grief that she'd expected, or something like it, the strange weight of 6 years ending. Not the adjustment of waking up without the particular alertness, the monitoring herself for what might go wrong today. Those things she'd prepared for, at least in the abstract. What she hadn't prepared for was Desmond Achabe. He called her 6 weeks after the conviction. He'd gotten her number through his attorney, who had worked with Tomas, and he'd asked very carefully if she would be willing to speak with him. She'd said yes, because the request had been careful and she had learned to trust the careful ones. They met over video call, him in his home in Atlanta, her in Blythe's kitchen in Portland. He was a quiet man in his mid-50s with the kind of steadiness that comes from having survived something and integrated it. "I want to thank you," he said. "Your sister found me, but what you collected made the case." "He stole from you," Noelle said. "He stole from both of us, just differently." Desmond was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what to do with the restitution," he said. "When it comes through. I can't take credit for the idea. It was my daughter who suggested it actually." He paused. "She's a social worker. She works with women in situations like yours." "What did she suggest?" "A fund," he said, "for women who need legal help getting out. The documentation piece. The thing you did, the evidence collection. Most women don't know how to do that. They don't have the training. But if there were resources, if there were people who could help them learn." Noelle set down her coffee. She thought about the shoebox behind the winter coats, the prepaid phone, Tomas's voice in the coffee shop in Wicker Park. Document everything. She thought about every woman who didn't have a medical degree that trained her to observe without distortion. Every woman who didn't have a sister like Blythe. Every woman who didn't stumble across exactly the right lawyer at exactly the right time. "Tell me more," she said. The Noelle Van Legal Defense Fund launched quietly, with no press release, 18 months after the conviction. It was operated out of Portland, in partnership with a domestic violence resource center that Desmond's daughter had been affiliated with for years. It provided legal consultation, documentation support, and safe exit planning for women who couldn't afford the help Noelle had been lucky enough to find. The first year, it served 43 women. Noelle ran a small piece of the fund's documentation training herself. Online sessions, anonymous, attended by women across the country who were doing what she had once done, preparing, quietly, for a day the person controlling them didn't know was coming. She told them what Tomas had told her. Document everything. Don't move money yet, don't change anything visible. Build it slow and build it airtight. She told them something Tomas hadn't told her, because she'd learned it herself. You will feel at some point like you are taking too long. Like you should have done this already, should have left already, should be further along. You are not taking too long. You are taking exactly as long as you need to take, and when the time comes, you will know. She did not tell them it was easy. It was not easy. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had spent her career doing hard things. She told them it was possible. Oliver was assigned to a federal correctional facility in Indiana. His first 6 months, by accounts that filtered back through attorney correspondence, and eventually through a journalist writing a piece on financial crime, were not comfortable. He had gone in expecting the social dynamics of his professional life to translate somehow, the way men like him always expect things to translate. They did not. He had been, in the language of the facility, sordid. Noelle did not follow the reports closely. She had, with deliberate effort, redirected the energy she'd once spent surviving him into building things instead. She'd started running again, something she'd stopped in the 3rd year of their marriage, when Oliver had begun commenting on how long she was gone. She'd started calling friends she'd allowed to drift. She'd started, slowly and carefully, letting people be close to her again. She was not rushed about any of it. There was a night, about a year after the conviction, when she was sitting on her own back porch. She had an apartment now, small and entirely hers, and her phone buzzed with an alert. A news aggregator had flagged Oliver's name. A piece about financial fraud sentencing and what it signaled for white-collar crime enforcement. His photograph was in the header. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the alert and went back to the book she'd been reading. And the night was very quiet, and somewhere in the city a train went past, and the sound of it was just the sound of a city moving, ordinary and indifferent and exactly as it should be. The shoebox was long gone. She hadn't needed it anymore. What she'd built from the evidence inside it. The 43 pages, the recordings, the careful dates and incidents and timestamps, was still out there, doing what she'd always hoped it might. Protecting people who needed protecting, in ways she'd never have imagined if she hadn't needed it herself. If someone tries to own you completely, make sure what you build from the wreckage is something they could never touch.